Lucia Sahai, the managing editor of War on the Rocks. You're listening to Horns of a Dilemma. This episode is part of a series of special live Horns episodes bringing you into the room at the 5th Annual Texas National Security Forum, hosted by our partners at the Clemens Center, the Strauss Center, and the Clemens Strauss Intelligence Studies Project. The forum was held in late November at the University of Texas at Austin. This second installment features a discussion on Russia with General Philip Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and Daniel Fried, former Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Mary Newberger of the University of Texas moderated.
We have three distinguished speakers. I'm not going to give their full bios, they're in the program. But just to introduce them here, we have General Philip Breedlove, who's a former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe in the U.S. Armed Forces. We have Evelyn Farkas, who's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia in the Obama administration. And Daniel Fried, the former Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs in the Obama administration. Each panelist will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. And then we'll have a conversation after. I'll ask a few questions and then we'll open it up to the audience. We'll try and keep to time and then there'll be a break after this panel. So, Philip, would you like to go first?
Please. So first of all, thanks to the organizers for having us here. This is my second time at this meeting and I really enjoyed the last one. So I'm glad to be back. And it is also good to be on this panel because these are not strangers to me. And I call Dan the professor because I've read and followed and listened to him for many years of my life. And as it was said a little earlier, it's always fun to have and good to have great friends who might be from a little different political persuasion than you. Evelyn and I have worked together a lot in our life, and we agree on about 98.5% of stuff. But we do come from a little different political background, but it's wonderful to have a great colleague, and it's great to be back on the stage with both of you. So I usually start these kind of things by answering a question that I am always asked every time in these kind of forums, and that is, are we in a new Cold War? And I usually shock people because I tell them, no, I don't think we're in a new Cold War. I think we're in a warm war. It's very different than the one that we've experienced in the past. Several of us in the group here are fairly aged, and we served in the Cold War for many, many years. And the Cold War, to me, was very well understood. Things were well defined. We knew who, what, where, and when our opponents were. We studied them. We sort of understand their thinking and the framework by which they act. I don't think that's anything like what we face today. We face opponents. We'll talk primarily about Russia. You will talk more about China later, that don't meet any of those criteria anymore. And the sort of norms that we had in the Cold War are now not norms anymore. I like to talk about Russia being engaged in a war below the lines. Some people call it active measures. Mr. Gerasimov talks about indirect means, asymmetric methods. There's lots of neat words out there, but it's very different than what we did before. The tools are the same, but they are being used in very different ways, and what I think is most shocking, very audacious, very bold ways, very forward. It's interesting to note that Mr. Gerasimov has been writing about this for a while. If you Google him today and go to the diagrams, you can see a PowerPoint slide that he built. It was built in Russian, but it's also in there in English, and you can just watch how he tracks the way that he does this war below the lines across in many countries, and it goes to different levels in each country. What is even more shocking now is that a couple of Chinese authors, you'll probably hear more about later, have written a book called Unlimited Warfare, and it looks almost exactly like Mr. Gerasimov's indirect means asymmetric methods, and it tracks in a very similar way. And now we see the same sort of tools being used against us. But Russia is very different in its approach, I think, to the United States of America and to its near abroad than it was during the Cold War. And I think that's the essence of why we find ourselves in a very different place. And it's my assertion, and my guess is that you will take me on this in the Q&A, that we see a relatively unchecked Russia, that Russia does not feel like it is being bounded in the actions that it can employ in those spaces of the former Warsaw Pact and in Eastern Europe, and that they see what they perceive as a lack of action by the West as they took further action in Crimea, post-Georgia in Crimea, then in the Donbass and other places. They see that the relative inaction of the West has allowed them a certain amount of freedom in their response, and I expect that you will take me on that in our Q&A. We in America have all the tools that other nations have. We face an opponent that understands how to attack us broadly across all the elements of national power. As a simple fighter pilot, I use a very easy model. There are lots of models for national power, and some of them, the acronyms go on for a half a page. I use DIME because I am a fighter pilot. Diplomatic power, informational power, military power, and economic power. We see Russia as it attacks nations. Let's just talk about Ukraine. Broadly trying to discredit the Ukraine government in Kyiv and saying that the Maidan was illegitimate and sponsored by Western nations and that the resulting government is not reflective of the people of Ukraine. Information or disinformation campaigns, we don't have to talk about how Russia uses that. I would be wasting our mutual time. Militarily, we see Russia once again putting military force back on the table to change internationally recognized borders in Europe. We had hoped that was over. We now see Crimea occupied, Donbass, a large support from Russia as it's occupied, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, economically, we have seen some very exquisite pressures brought on Ukraine and other nations via energy, the recalling of loans, the changing of pricing, the shutting off, actually, of the flow of some energy during cold winters. And so broadly, we see Russia applying diplomatic, informational, military, and economic power as they bring their war below the lines on some of our friends and allies. How do we respond? Diplomatically, I would say we didn't respond very well. We handed the fight over to Ms. Merkel and Mr. Hollande through the Minsk process to take care of this Ukraine thing. Informationally, we haven't engaged anybody in an information war. Al-Qaeda, China, Russia, we just haven't. Militarily, we have avoided provoking Russia, and so we took very light military responses. And then economically, when we deal with Russia, that's how we do it. We have massive sanctions, and every time we think about responding to Russia, the first thing out of our mouth is we need to do more sanctions, or what are the possible sanctions? So I'm being a bit provocative, but what I'm saying is that we face an opponent that uses all of the elements of national power when they address their near abroad and us in the West. And we in the West tend to come back at them in a very unbalanced way and maybe should examine some of the other approaches that the military should respond to a Russia. Okay, now just for the last minute or two of my time, I want to do something very uncharacteristic of me. As a major commander many times in my life, when bad news came in the door, I remember two rules that I was taught as a young man. It's never as good or as bad as you first hear, and the fact that you're going to be told a story that supports whoever is walking in the door to give you the issue. And so there's always two sides to the story, and you need to be observant of that. So I think that it's instructive that we listen a little bit to what the Russians are saying. So in the last several months, we've had a couple of delegations that went to Russia at a very high level and brought back some pretty interesting feedback. And what they paint is the story. This is the other side of the story, not our side. They see a nation that is very much aggrieved. They continue to believe that NATO is purposely expanding, that U.S. involvement in their near abroad is dangerous and expanding, and they're very focused on what we're thinking about for Poland. They say, and these are some of their specific words captured. Of course, they were in Russian, translated to English. Everyone is against us. Russia is automatically guilty of everything. You, the United States, are unpredictable. You make our security deeply uncomfortable. We didn't start this. We didn't interfere in your election. We didn't start this diplomatic war. And oh, by the way, Russia and Ukraine are the same. We're tired of talking about it. The U.S. is and was irresponsible in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. And the legitimacy of American democracy is declining. Your election shows the fragility of the U.S. experiment. Our relationship grows darker and darker. We understand each other less and less all the time. So I hate to start on a bad note, but I'm an engineer by training, and we study vectors. And our vector with Russia is bad. Vectors don't change themselves. We have to do something about it. And in my opinion, in today's political environment, and I blame both sides of the aisle equally on this issue, in our political environment, we are unable to enter into what I would call meaningful discussions with Russia, because you either get called a pro-Trump or an anti-Trump person, and often the conversations are then minimized. My big plea, or my last and closing comment today, is we desperately need to find meaningful ways ahead to have conversations with Russia about how to address the grievances that we clearly disagree on.
Well, first of all, thank you very much to the organizers, to Will and Bobby. This is a phenomenal group of people, and so far, fantastic conversation. So hopefully I won't be so provocative or so boring that you won't consider inviting me back someday. And thank you, Mary, for moderating. Thank you, all of you, for your attention. I've kind of thought and written and rewritten my own remarks, because sometimes I think I assume that people know a lot about Russia and why Russia is doing what Russia's doing and why we have a terrible relationship with Russia today. And so I don't want to insult the intelligence of the audience. And then I get tempted by my good colleague, Phil Breedlove, General Breedlove, who have made some excellent points, and some of which I want to agree with. And as he said, 98% of which I want to agree with. And then there are a few things where I would maybe tailor them a little bit. So let me just, I guess, step back just a second, because what I like to do really anytime I talk about Russia is kind of step back, take a big picture look, and say, why do we have this problem with Russia? Essentially, since the end of the Cold War, we have tried to treat Russia like any other European country. To most of us in the room, that sounds great. To the Russians, that sounds horrible. They never wanted to be treated like any other country. So when we had diplomats, experienced diplomats like Secretary Albright say, we treated them with respect. We offered them even the potential in the long run of NATO membership. We gave them economic assistance, et cetera, et cetera. That goes by the Russians, because what they really wanted was a special relationship. And that's what they continue to want. They don't consider themselves a nation just like France, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, you name it. They consider themselves separate, special, and it is, in a sense, the loss of empire. There is a lot of trauma associated with that in the sense of being special, and we in the West failed to understand that. So I would say that where we failed was in the misunderstanding of the Russian psyche, of the people and the people leading Russia, and that includes Boris Yeltsin. Even that relationship, which I would say was the most positive and fruitful relationship when Russia was most weak and couldn't really stand up for itself. that relationship was positive, but even then you had Boris Yeltsin very clearly standing up for Russian prerogatives and refusing to be a state like any other European state. So I think it's important to understand that part of the problem we have with Russia is a misunderstanding of how we perceive them versus how they perceive themselves. The second thing having to do with NATO is, yes, of course, from a military perspective, if you're sitting in the Ministry of Defense in Russia, you don't like the idea of NATO expansion. But from a political military perspective, I believe that the Russians should at least try to understand a little better what we were trying to achieve with NATO expansion, because it never was fully, only for some members was it completely, like Poland, completely about checking Russia and making sure that Russia had no revanchist impulses left. In fact, for the majority of the NATO members, when they expanded to Central Europe and then even more importantly to the Balkans and other areas, it was about spreading stability and security. It was the best way that we knew to foster democracy, the transfer to a capitalist free market economy. And so we saw, and we continue to see NATO as a way of spreading stability. Because one of the first things you have to do when you say you would like to join NATO is you as a country have to say, I accept my borders, I have good relations with my neighbors. Internally, we take care of our minorities. We have good relations between the ethnic groups in our country. So we will not be prone to civil war that NATO will have to deal with in one way, shape, or form. And certainly we will not wage war on our neighbors. And so that's really, I think, the crux of what NATO is all about. Of course, if there's an outside power like Russia, where there's a long history of mistrust and invasion, and you're Central European, you would have a different perspective. But nevertheless, I think the Russians, maybe they don't understand it or they don't want to understand it. So I think with NATO expansion as being a cause of upsetting the relationship or irritating the relationship, I have very little patience for that. And so I want to kind of make that point before maybe it gets raised in Q&A. Then to today's problem, really, and the first panel talked about it at length, the Russians are basically challenging the status quo, even though they benefited from the international order as the Soviet Union. Coming out of the 2000s, Vladimir Putin decided that this order was not to Russia's liking. He wanted to go back to a balance of power, sphere of influence, international order. We know from history what that's led to, World War I, World War II. Again, we heard that from the panel this morning. But that's why Russia is so dangerous, because Russia is essentially challenging the international order, saying the big guys, the strongest powers, can negotiate the state of international affairs among them, and the rest have to go along. So you see why it's so dangerous for Russia to, for the first time since World War II, seize Crimea, illegally annexing that piece of territory that belongs to another country, changing a border for the first time since World War II by force. That is dangerous because if Russia gets away with it, then there are other countries who are very happy to follow suit. I'm sure many of you, I can make a joke and say, I'm sure you all noticed that Viktor Orban, shortly after the seizure of Crimea and the statements that Vladimir Putin made about needing to take care of the Russian people and the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the Hungarian prime minister came out and said, well, we understand this because we have Hungarian minorities, and they do. They have Hungarian minorities in 5 countries around Hungary. These territories used to be part of Hungary until the end of World War I when they lost, and the territories now belong to other states. And Hungary, of course, as a member of NATO, has accepted the inviolability of the existing borders. But nevertheless, Viktor Orban has, with the help of Vladimir Putin, over time increasingly started to put questions in people's minds. And so what Russia has done is so dangerous because it's given other countries the sense that there might be an opening also for them to somehow negotiate borders. And so Crimea is very important. And then, of course, what Russia's doing in Donbass, where they've essentially started a civil war. The latest confrontation in the Kerch Strait between the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, that I see as a political economic maneuver. That's Russia trying to exert political pressure through economic means on the government in Kyiv. Why is Russia doing what it's doing vis-a-vis Ukraine? Because, again, it gets back to the balance, the sphere of influence. Russia wants to have a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, over the former Soviet space, to include, actually, if it can get away with it, because Vladimir Putin and his Kremlin are very opportunistic, the East Bloc as well. So he's very happy to also have good, friendly relations and do business with, as I mentioned earlier, Hungary and other states in the former East Bloc. So I think that, for me, is what's important about Russia and the problem of Russia today. It's because Russia's challenging the international order. And it does also align with the problem we're having with regard to the standoff between democracy and autocracy, because, again, Vladimir Putin, not only does he want a sphere of influence, but he wants to maintain his rule, the way that he rules within Russia, which is an autocratic rule, a crony capitalism, and he doesn't want his rule to be disturbed by any Democrats inside of Russia or outside of Russia. He sees the United States in particular, but also our allies to some extent, as trying to force democracy on Russia and get rid of him. I always say, you know, the more he acts the way he does, the more we wish that we had a different government in Moscow. But the United States, of course, has never had a plan to eliminate the government of Russia. But Putin sees every move that's made politically, all of the advances democratically in the region around Russia, as very much a potential threat to him. And Ukraine, which is considered by the Russians, as the general just said, part of one entity, political entity with Russia, that would be the biggest threat to the Russian government if Ukraine became a viable, strong political, economic democracy. And I say that because I remember going to Kyiv and listening to the Ukrainians after the Maidan revolution and after they, you know, had the shooting of 100 people and the realization that now they were at war with Russia. And the generals and the politicians all said, the scales fell from our eyes. We realized, you know, these Russians, they're not our brothers. And we finally understood what the young people wanted. And this, I think, relates to Putin's fear. The young people looked at Poland, and if you're Ukrainian, historically, you're big and you're strong and you were always better than Poland. Yet they looked across the border and they saw this very wealthy, prosperous Poland. Dan Fried, Ambassador Fried knows this very well. And they said, wait a minute, how did those guys get so far ahead of us economically? And so the youth in Ukraine was largely responsible for, I'm wrapping up, largely responsible for the Maidan and the move to really push the Ukrainian government at the time to move towards an EU association agreement rather than staying within the Moscow sphere of influence. So I just mentioned that because it's a good reminder of what is going on when we talk about the Russia challenge. I think for the United States, it's imperative that we defend the international order and that we defend democracy, because we see democracy is weak now across the board without the leadership that we have. You know, somebody said something to me, well, these United Nations, all these institutions, they're useless. They're only as useful as the leadership that leads them. And so if we can get a good set of leaders, American and transatlantic, I would argue, with our other democratic allies, Japan, Israel, et cetera, we could actually defend democracy better. And so I would end by saying we really need a new set of leaders. We need a call for leadership.
Okay, well, what is left for me to say? The previous panel talked about Russia as a declining power, but doing damage on the way down, and that's about right. You're getting this spelled out in pretty graphic terms. But to try to match Phil Breedlove with provocation, I'll start with a quote from Donald J. Trump. Wouldn't it be nice if we got along with Russia? Right? He said that in 2016. He's right. It would be nice, which is why the Clinton administration, Bush administration, and Obama administrations all tried, and they all failed. And in fact, the arc of try and fail between Bush and Obama was almost identical. And I participated in both those administrations' Russia policies, at least Obama in the beginning. And it was not for lack of trying on the part of the United States. And because two such different presidents failed in such similar ways leads to suspicion that the problem wasn't really the United States. So what would it take, and this is to get to Phil Breedlove's closing challenge, which is the right challenge, you know, what do we do about it? what would it take to work with Russia? Russia's terms for a good relationship with the United States are not hard to figure out. And it's what Evelyn was talking about earlier. Russia insists on a sphere of influence, Russian style. Russian style means they keep the countries around them subservient, weak, under their thumb. The difference between American policy toward Mexico and Russian policy toward Ukraine is this. For the United States, a prosperous, happy, wealthy, stable Mexico is a good thing. Like, we make lots of money, the problems tend to go away. For Russia, a prosperous, stable, democratic Ukraine is a nightmare, because such a Ukraine is apt to try to join the European Union and pull away from Russia. And this Russia cannot stand. They really do, by the way, think of the Ukrainians as their little brothers and the Ukrainian language as a debased peasant Southern Russian dialect. And then the Ukrainians, object to being told they don't exist, except to the degree they do, they're fascists. That's the problem with a better relationship with Russia. It requires us to give the Russians a free hand in what they call their sphere of influence, which is basically any country Russia has dominated. That we cannot do without abandoning our own principles and the last 100 years of American grand strategy. And that is the source of the standoff. Why is Russia so insistent on a sphere of influence of that type? And, I recently reread George Kennan's long telegram from 1946, and it was depressingly current. He describes Kennan describes Stalin's motives in ways that apply to Vladimir Putin. Russia is backward compared to the West. Russia is not willing to reform its domestic institutions to allow itself to prosper, and therefore it has to keep democracy, the West, and all Western influence at bay, both geographically and ideologically. Therefore, Russia must discredit democracy in principle, and it must crush democracy where it threatens to succeed in any of Russia's neighbors. All right, Stalin, Putin. Yeah, I know it's not the same in terms of the bodies piling up, at least not yet. But it is the same in terms of worldview and Russian grand strategy. Now, are we doomed to deal with that kind of a Russia forever? Now, Russia hands can be divided up into many categories, but here are two that I'm going to try out. There are those Russia hands who believe that Russia can be nothing better than its lousy current self, that we're doomed to the kind of Russia we have, that all they understand is force, and that the best we can expect is a long-term policy of containment. Now, there is, I will admit, an awful lot of evidence to support that dark view. But I don't completely share it. And that's a surprise because I am known as at least RT, the Russian propaganda machine, calls me one of the chief Russophobes. And since I was the architect of the sanctions against Russia, they really don't like me at all. Nah. Okay, and then in the Clinton administration, Tony Blinken, Jim Steinberg, and I were champions of NATO enlargement, so they haven't liked me for a very long time. But I don't believe the countries are necessarily prisoners of their own history. Now, that's my American distortion, right? My American optimism coming in, kicking in here. But I think that Russia has in its history been better. I think before the Russian Revolution, it was on a convergence course with the West economically and even beginning politically. It was drawing even with the West in terms of culture. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky, I don't think that the failure of Russia's democratic transformation in the 1990s was inevitable. I think that transformation was harder in Russia than it was in Poland, because Poland had regained its sovereignty, Russia had lost its empire. But I don't think that Russia is doomed to live down to its worst history. But to get to that better Russia, we need to deal with and push back against the lousy Russia we've got today. So I do not disagree, as much as I'd like to, with Phil Breedlove's characterization of war, because I see it every day, right? The disinformation campaigns in Europe and the United States, the attacks against Ukraine recently, just days ago, in this, at the Kerch Straits, as Evelyn was talking about. To get to that better Russia, we have to discredit the Putin argument that he is leading Russia to renewed greatness. Now, this is not an original thought on my part. Eric Edelman and I were in the Reagan administration on the Soviet desk when both of us had hair. It was a long time ago. And we had, under Reagan and George P. Shultz, probably the best Soviet policy this country ever had, which was simultaneously putting pressure on the Soviet Union across the board and reaching out to the then new Gorbachev leadership. 2 tracks, and George Shultz was told, you can't do 2, you have to link positive steps and negative steps, and he said, nonsense. We're going to reach out to them where we can, and we're going to push back where we have to, and we're not going to worry about the contradiction between hot and cold. That's their problem. We can't do that with Putin. You can't reach out much to him, but you can and probably should start having a dialogue with serious Russians. Those nasty quotes that Phil Breedlove mentioned, I've heard them too. But I've heard, and I bet you've heard, and Evelyn has heard other things that Russians are saying. It feels to me like it was in the early 1980s when I served in the Soviet Union. You have Russians looking around, make sure nobody's listening, and then saying, we can't go on like this. There's something wrong. Yeah, that's right. Guys, there is. And you're going down a very dark road. It's going to get nastier. And at the end of that road, that light at the end of the tunnel is probably the Chinese waiting for you to emerge so they can eat you alive. I enjoyed telling that to the Russians. But we should not. Why on earth should we assume that current trajectories in Russia are inevitable? When has Russian history followed a straight line like ever? And I remember that the principal failing of some parts of the Reagan administration, though not President Reagan himself, was to assume that nothing could change, right? That the Soviet Union could not be anything other than the evil empire. Actually, Reagan had figured out that since he figured communism was doomed, maybe Gorbachev understood that too, and things would change. It is possible to get to a better Russia if we act in a firm, determined manner to deal with the lousy Russia we've got today. And a final topical thought, since I started with Donald J. Trump, I will end with President Trump. I'm glad he called off the meeting with Putin at the G20 because no meeting is better than a bad meeting. But as an American, that should not be our binary choice. The US president should not be so distracted by Russia factors in American domestic politics and his own, let us say, personal complexities with the Russians to be able to deal with the Russians. And if, I'm inspired by Phil Breedlove here, the right message to Putin would be, we know what you're doing in Ukraine. Don't waste my time denying it. We know what you're doing in the United States and Europe. Cut it out. We will deal with you as handily as we did in the 1980s. If you figure out a different path, we're ready. And here are the areas we could cooperate on. Now, that's not so hard a message, but I and a lot of others were relieved that the meeting was canceled because we remembered Helsinki. And for those of us watching the press conference live, you could tell when the president went off the script, the perfectly capable statement his NSC staff had prepared for him, and started winging it. We deserve better circumstances than this. I suspect we will get them. The challenge is great. The possibilities exist for a better relationship ahead. And if Willem Bowden is here, thanks for the opportunity. This is great.
Thanks for listening to Horns of a Dilemma. Be sure to check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.